The Laundering, Volume 2, Case 35, The Retrospect. What we admit and when we admit it. Open the case. A note, this one touches genocide, both abroad and at home.
A senator rose and asked for the smallest thing. Not a condemnation, not a sanction, not a policy, only that the government examine Canada's own risk of complicity in violations of international law, in light of the world courts, and report back in 3 months. Look, and tell us what you see. The motion was defeated. Moving it, Senator Yuen Pao Wu named the pattern it ran against. It took Canada over a decade to acknowledge and apologize for its inaction on the Rwandan genocide. Will it take as long again on Palestine? This case is about that decade, the gap between a harm and its admission. Canada acknowledges, often with real feeling. It acknowledges late, when the cost has been paid and the admission can be filed under lessons learned. The benevolent self-image is not threatened by the apology. It is fed by it.
Isn't the honest thing to take a side on Gaza?
This case does not and will not. Whether Canada is complicit is precisely the question it leaves open. Strip the subject away and a structure remains. A temporal one in the family of Case 9, the retrospective. The honesty was real. The honesty came late. The cost was already paid. A nation maintains an asset, its reputation, the image of itself as decent, and that asset is managed by when it agrees to look. Refuse the examination in the present, where a finding could constrain you. Grant the acknowledgement in the future, where it constrains nothing.
And the premises?
4. 1. Acknowledgement is good. A nation that can admit fault is healthier than one that cannot, and Canada has made real admissions. Grant it in full. 2. Those admissions arrive characteristically late. Rwanda acknowledged 16 years on, domestic harms across generations, after the moment when looking could have changed anything. 3. A refusal to examine in the present does not resolve the question. It only guarantees that any reckoning comes in retrospect, on the safe side of the harm. 4. The spine. Because a retrospective admission can be folded into a story of growth, it reinforces the benevolent self-image rather than wounding it. Refuse now. Admit when costless. That is the laundering. The apology is the rinse. There is a louder reading that the peaceful, polite Canada brand is a deliberate anesthetic, a maple glaze over an imperial project. That is carried as a named lens, attributed and not adopted. The narrow claim needs none of its heat.
How little was actually asked?
On the 7th of October 2025, Senator Wu moved, in full, that, in light of findings and orders from the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court on the situation in Gaza, the Senate call on the government to examine the risk to Canada and Canadians of complicity in violations of international humanitarian law, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and to report on its findings within 3 months.
And what does that do?
It reaches no verdict. It asks the government to reach its own and to report. It invokes the world courts not as conclusions, but as reasons to look. It sets a modest deadline. It is the lowest possible rung of accountability, an internal risk assessment, the kind any prudent institution runs as a matter of course. And it was defeated, reported 40-12. Whatever one believes about the war, the thing refused here was not a judgment. It was a look.
The senator supplied the precedent himself.
And it is exact. In 1994, Canadian Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, commanding the UN mission in Rwanda, warned that a genocide was coming and was refused the authority and the troops to stop it. Some 800,000 people were killed. Canada's formal acknowledgement of its share of that failure came in 2010, 16 years later, when Governor-General Michael Jean told Rwandans that Canada readily acknowledges its fair share of responsibility. The acknowledgement was sincere. It was also safe. By 2010, nothing it said could put a single Canadian decision-maker at risk or alter one death.
And what did the late admission do for the self-image?
Never Again, said over Rwanda in 2010, did not read as an indictment of Canadian conduct. It read as proof of Canadian conscience, the very decency the brand asserts, confirmed by the act of confession. The harm was metabolized into the myth. So will it take as long again is not a flourish. It is a question about the machine. If the only acknowledgement on offer is the kind that arrives 16 years late and burnishes the apologizer, then the present refusal to look is not a delay in accountability. It is the design of it.
What's the tell?
The refusal of the examination itself. You cannot be found complicit in the present in a thing you have declined to examine, and that is the quiet function of voting the look down. It is the containment move of Case 16, the container, applied not to a document, but to a question. Heap the inquiry from beginning, and the finding it might have produced never exists to be managed. No examination, no report, no report, no record. No record, nothing in the present tense for the self-image to answer for.
And that's why the refusal and the apology are one mechanism.
Yes, the apology, 16 years on, is a finding the nation can afford because the moment to act on it has passed. The refused examination is the finding the nation cannot afford because it would land while action is still possible, while arms permits, recruitment rules, and sanctions decisions are live. So the live question is declined, and the dead one is embraced, and the gap between them is the decade. What looks like a country willing to face its history is a country arranging never to face its present, on the confidence that the present will, in time, become history it can safely confess.
Build the case against the motion at its strongest.
There is a real one, and a serious senator could vote no in good faith. A legislative chamber directing the executive to investigate its own potential criminal complicity on a fixed clock raises genuine questions of role and separation. The courts the motion cites are themselves mid-process, their ultimate findings unmade, and a government may argue it is wrong to presuppose the frame of a case still being argued. Foreign and defense policy carry confidences a public report cannot simply ventilate, and a member may believe, sincerely, that the motion's framing prejudges the very conflict it claims only to examine. These are not frivolous, and the no-side specific arguments deserve to be read in full in the record.
And yet,
Grant all of it. The narrow claim survives because it does not depend on the motion being wise or well-drafted, and it reaches no verdict on Gaza. It depends only on this. A request to look was refused, and Canada's documented habit is to look in retrospect. One can hold that the motion was flawed and still see the structure, that the safe time to examine is always declared to be later, and that later, for a reputation-managing state, is the time when examination can no longer cost anything. The honest answer to a premature motion is a better-framed examination. Now, the answer that was given was no examination and a wait.
the mover did not leave the pattern abroad. He named its domestic twin directly, the cynical, twisted logic
that allowed Canada to pretend for 150 years that it did its best for Indigenous peoples, that it had no idea of the harms caused. The same clock runs at home, and here the present tense is documented, not alleged. As of 2026, by the government's own count, 39 long-term drinking water advisories remain in effect across 37 First Nations communities, roughly half in place for more than a decade. The Auditor General rated the federal effort unsatisfactory. By Statistics Canada's measures, suicide among First Nations youth runs about 5 to 6 times the non-Indigenous rate, and among Inuit youth, roughly 24 times. These are not retrospect. They are now.
And the acknowledgement?
Runs on the familiar lag. Canada's own national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls concluded, in 2019, that the violence amounted to a race-based genocide of Indigenous peoples, rooted in colonialism, a finding the state commissioned, received, and has largely left as words. Former commissioners marked 5 years with the calls for justice still substantially unmet. The series adopts no totalizing verdict here and does not need the louder one. It reports what Canadian institutions have themselves found, on the lag at which they found it. The point is not a slogan about the nation's nature. It is the same temporal structure, twice, abroad in a refused look, at home in a finding received and shelved.
Name it.
A nation holds an image of itself as decent, and that image is an asset it manages, and the management has a tense. In the present, where a finding could constrain a permit, a recruitment, a sale, a vote, the nation declines to look. The motion to examine is defeated, the question kept from being asked. In retrospect, where a finding can constrain nothing, the nation acknowledges, sometimes in the heaviest words available, and the acknowledgement is received not as an indictment, but as evidence of the very conscience the image claims. The harm is metabolized, the brand is refreshed, and the clock resets for the next one. Refuse now, confess later, stay benevolent throughout.
And the reading test?
The series does not say Canada is complicit in Gaza. It notes that Canada refused to examine whether it is. It does not pronounce on genocide. It reports that the motion used the word, that the world courts have done the narrower things they have done, and that a Canadian inquiry reached its own finding about Canada's own conduct. So when a nation that apologizes beautifully for its past refuses to examine its present, do the one thing the apology is designed to forestall. Hold the confession against the calendar. Ask not whether it admits the old harm, but whether it will look at the live one. Now, before the looking is safe. If it will look while looking still costs something, the decency is real. If it will only confess once confession is free, the maple glaze is doing its job. You are not watching a conscience. You are watching it managed.